Well, Joan, thanks so much for joining me on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. It's great to have you.
It is an absolute honor to be here, Davey.
We got connected through a staff member of ours, Amy. You guys have, your paths have crossed, and she has spoken so highly of you and the work that you do. And I'm just really excited to hear firsthand how God has been showing up in your story and how he's helping you to reveal that to other people as well. I think that's one of the unique things about what you do. But before we dive into your story, before we dive into some of the work that you're doing, would you just tell us a little bit about you right now? Where do you live? What do you do? Tell us a little bit about what your family's like. What is life for Joan Kelley right now?
Okay. Well, first off, I am a wife to John. We live in Palatine, Illinois, northwest suburb of Chicago. I am a mom of 4, but now 5, actually. My daughter got married last year. She's 26. I have a 23-year-old that lives in the city and works there. Almost 21-year-old who is going to be a junior in college, and then our oldest son, Will, that we're going to share a piece of his story today, passed away about 12 years ago.
Wow.
And so those are some of my biggest, I'll say, teachers besides God in my life. And then as far as what my life is like right now, I am a spiritual director. So I meet with people really as a companion in their spiritual journeys. And I also lead a ministry called Sacred with a dear friend, Gail Donahue. We lead guided solitude retreats every other month here in the Chicago area, or help people, create those for themselves elsewhere, and just really inviting them into the rhythm that Jesus modeled for us to come away to be with their Father. And sometimes we need a little help to understand and experience that rhythm. So that's Sacred. And then the other ministry I've volunteered with as kind of the director of facilitator development is called One Life Maps. And it's based on a curriculum called Listen to My Life. And really the best way to describe that ministry is a subtitle, which is recognizing and responding to God in your story. So I know that's a heartbeat for you as well. Yeah. But this curriculum of really 8 maps, visual maps that help you document your story, past, present, and future. So looking at your life story, your life right now, peaks, valleys, desires, and longings. So that is a ministry that I've adored and am a part of, and has really changed my life as well. So those are the things kind of going on in my life right now.
Man, there's so much already that you've mentioned that I want to unpack. But I think the first place that we have to go, because, we talk about all the time that so much of our purpose gets informed by the pain that we walk through. And God wants to take us on that journey from pain to purpose. I'd love for you to share a little bit about the story of your oldest son that you lost, you said 12 years ago, and just what that journey was like for you, because I'm sure that it has informed a lot of what you do now.
It certainly has, and I was already doing a few of those things prior to that. So let me tell you a little bit about that piece of our story. It is not our whole story, but it is a piece of it. Will was our oldest. He was 16 at the time, so our kids were 16. Megan was 13. Drew was 10. And Mitch was 7. So all about 3 years apart, but to be honest, those are kind of the golden years right in there. Right. Not a perfect family, but just a sweet season. Will had just finished his sophomore year in high school. Super athletic. He'd kind of come into his own physical body and academically doing pretty well, and spiritually in a good place. And I kind of felt like I was seeing this man unfold in front of me. Yeah. And it was kind of the first part of June. He had some kind of injury, and he'd also had, a few just little bumps on his head. And when he went in, he asked the doctor about that. And he's like, I think they're just bug bites or something. And then a few weeks later, we were actually headed out on a road trip with our family to a wedding out in New York. So we were kind of getting packed up that week and getting ready. And Will had just been lethargic. Our whole family had been doing this running club in the mornings, and he's probably the most athletic of all of us. And he just wasn't able to really do it. And I'm like, gosh, he's, teenager, he's being lazy or whatever and doesn't want to come. But I decided to take him into the doctor to check out what was going on. I thought, well, maybe he's just got mono and I need to figure this out before we load, all 6 of us in the car and head out on Friday. And this is a Wednesday. And so we went in and the pediatrician said, you know what, let's just do some blood work and check, and did that. And it happened to be our 20th wedding anniversary. And I remember that day specifically. I was at this bookstore and I bought John a anniversary card, and I remember the chair I sat in, and essentially what I wrote is, I can't imagine doing life with anybody else, and have, loved the journey so far. I can't wait to see what God has for us next.
Wow.
And so that afternoon, actually heading into evening, was heading out for dinner with John, and the pediatrician called with the test results. And she said, Mrs. Kelley, are you alone? And I'm like, well, I don't want to hear that from you. Am I alone or is someone with you? And
wow.
She said, I need to tell you that based on the blood test, Will's white cell count is like 243,000 and it's supposed to be 6,000. I'm almost certain he has leukemia. And my heart dropped. I had no idea even what leukemia was. Vaguely I did. And she said, I need you to tell your son and pack a bag for a week and head downtown Chicago. So I quickly went and told Will as best I could and scooted off the kids to a neighbor's house, not knowing what was really ahead of us. And as we got in the car, I remember thinking, okay, who do I know? Who do I know? I'm an engineer and a planner by background. I do a lot of ministry stuff now, but like I've got to have a plan.
Yeah.
And so I called a friend who had this person's name I needed, and it was a pastor, a community pastor at our church, whose daughter, who happened to be the same age as my daughter, who had leukemia and was at the same hospital that we were actually heading in the car to. And it was funny because God had put that family on our path in the last 2 years, kind of just gently. I'd see them at the grocery store, or I followed along on their caring bridge. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what if that was my, in that case, daughter, since our daughters were the same age. And so I called this man, Tom, and I said, Tom, here's the situation. And I said, what would you want to know? Go back to day one. What would you want to know? And I've got my Post-it. I found the Post-it the other day, actually, and in the car, and a pen, and I'm waiting for him to tell me this doctor or this medicine or this protocol or whatever. And he said, Joan, I think I'd want to know that he's God's child first. And I thought, oh, that's hard to hear.
Yeah.
And feels like kind of crappy advice from a pastor right now.
Yeah.
But actually, it was God setting the stage for what was going to unfold and beginning to remind my heart and transform my heart to start to live into those words in a deeper way. And anybody who has cancer begins to do that subconsciously, whether you know that or not. Anyway, we got to the hospital. It was very surreal. In the emergency room, I remember them coming in and confirming the diagnosis. They simply did some more blood work, and I just looked at them and I said, "Are you sure?" And they're like, "We're 99.9% sure." And you're now going to be heading up to the oncology floor. And I remember getting up there, I remember walking down the hall, and there are these posters and images of these beautiful bald children. And, our family loves to give and to run 5Ks and make meals for people. We were the people prior to this on the other side. Right. I mean, in fact, Will and I had just ran a 5K for an organization like a couple months prior. Wow. And here we are, and we are those people, and we've joined this club that we didn't really want to join. Yeah. And so with leukemia, particularly with a boy, the treatment is 3.5 years of chemo and radiation and, all kinds of other things. And we were in the hospital for about a week. And essentially they just begin blasting it with these drugs. And because they are young and resilient, it goes away almost immediately. But because it's a blood cancer, it's in your blood.
Yeah.
And so that's why the treatment is so long.
Wow.
And so for, the next 10 months, essentially, we followed the protocol. Literally, there was like a spreadsheet, and you do this, and you take this med, and this might happen, and this might happen. And the other thing that happened was God showed up in our community around us. With meals and help, and our neighborhood got around us, and our church got around us. And I remember one moment in particular. So this was in June, and when he was diagnosed, and in August, a dear friend who lived next door, Marina, who has 4 children as well, that kind of matched up with ours, said, "Joan, I have this idea. I don't want to do it, so feel free to say no, but God keeps putting it on my heart." And she said, "I think we should do a prayer vigil before school starts for Will and for those in the community dealing with hard things." And so she said, "And it's only going to be 10 minutes long. It's just going to be silence." And so we're like, well, if the 2 of our families show up, that's 12 people. So that's great. And so we had, and I had been doing a Caring Bridge blog, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, all along, kind of documenting the story, but also like, where's God at in the story? And I really kind of say that blog, saved my life, my spiritual life, to be honest. And so we put it out there, and that night, 200 people showed up in our yard and encircled our house and sat on the swings and on blankets in the yard and came up on their bikes and their skateboards and their cars. And they prayed for Will.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the most pivotal moments in my spiritual walk, because I literally saw God at my door and in my house and on my yard. In fact, before we started, I just realized this as we're talking, one of my practices recently has been to just go out and in between things, walk my yard. I love flowers and gardening. I'm a farm girl by, that's how I grew up. And there's something about noticing God and feeling close to God in that space. And so, but that's the space all those people showed up. So during the vigil, I would just say, I remember walking around upstairs in our house because Will was not feeling well. So he was still up in his room, which is on the front side of the house. And I remember going from window to window, looking out and like, God has showed up in my yard today and I needed to see him.
Wow.
And so it was a incredibly powerful day. Will actually at the end of it was able to come downstairs and greet people. And I can still picture that day like anything. And so anyway, there were just moment after moment like that during our journey. Will was ill 10 months and where God just kept showing up. I'm like, yes, God is at work. Oh my gosh, this is going to bring so many people to Jesus because they're going to see how he heals. Yeah. And Will continued to go to school as much as he could. He was nauseous pretty much every day for that whole year. I thought of him the other day. I was nauseous with something else. And like, how did he do this? How did he function? But he did. And from day one, he's like, it's okay. It's just really annoying is what he would say. And so, anyway, it transformed our family. I can fully say today that we are a different family because of that. Do I wish that it didn't happen? Absolutely. Do I want my boy to walk in the back door? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that year continued on. And so he's diagnosed in June. He made it through there was weekly chemo, lots of hospital stays. He made it through all the weekly chemo. Now we're about 9 months in. He did a month of brain radiation. And he was actually coming out of that to some degree. And I felt like, we're moving towards a monthly chemo. Like I think we can do this pattern that's ahead of us. And for some reason, his body caught this set of fluky infections, and we landed back in ICU. And for 3 weeks, he just battled. And the infections were there because of, one of the things that you take along the way is an antibiotic, to be honest. And it was a side effect of being on an antibiotic for an extended period of time. So it wasn't even the cancer that got him. It was a side effect of the very thing trying to save his life. And so we had 3 weeks of time in ICU, and really kind of got down to the last week and the last couple days. And the doctors had called us into a meeting, which you never want to be at. And they said, he's got about a 5% chance to live.
Goodness.
And we kind of thought we had like a 30% chance to live.
Right.
And so they had one more idea. They tried so hard. So hard. And they knew there was something different in our room too. In fact, there was one, the head of ICU was a Jewish man, lovely, lovely man. And he just kept showing up in our room. I think partially because he couldn't quite figure out what was going on. They never really did totally diagnose what the infection was or how to treat it. And he's like, there's something different in here. And he'd bring me Starbucks coffee in the morning or, whatever. I don't drink coffee, but, he noticed something, and the nurses noticed something. He sensed God in the room. And we had prayer vigils in the room, for 30 minutes. People would call in on Zoom or whatever we used at that point in time. It's probably something on free conferencing, I think.
Right.
I guess we were before our time in terms of virtual things. This is in 2010. And we would have a virtual prayer vigil for Will most nights.
Wow.
And so we got to his final day, and they tried the one last thing, and then his body just started shutting down. And the worst nightmare that any parent can have was having to make the decision that, we just could not continue on life-saving efforts for his body that was really already gone, to be honest.
Yeah. Wow.
And so on May 21st of 2010, Will passed away. And we decided, we made some really conscious choices with our other kids. We came home and told them, they had no idea, but they knew because mom and dad were both there, that something was drastically wrong because they hadn't seen us in the same room for weeks and weeks. And it was horrible. And we decided to take them back down to the hospital to see him one more time, and for them to have realized like that isn't Will there.
Right. Yeah.
Will's with Jesus. And, just made some other choices like that along the way, and how we did things even for the celebration of life and included them along the way. And I think as hard as it was, and they were at a wide variety of ages, I think it was an important part of them realizing we can grieve together, we can grieve separately, but mom and dad are going to be there and meet us, right where we're at. And so I always say, that day, I fully realized, that Will was God's child first. And so that's really began our grief journey together as a family, which, continues on today.
Yeah.
For each one of us.
Yeah. Wow. Joan, I think it's I think there's so many things that stand out to me as you're sharing all this stuff. The first thing that I definitely want to underscore is just even back as you guys are walking this journey to fight this thing, just how remarkable it is that you're leaning into some of those, with your journaling and some of those moments where you're asking some big existential questions of God.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times when you receive a diagnosis like this, it's like, okay, it's time to we're going to fight this thing. We're going to beat this thing. How critical was that, do you feel like, in the journey, preparing you for the outcome of this, that you were leaning into, where is God in all of this?
I think it was incredibly important. I think I'm not saying that my grief has been really smooth, but I would say I can recognize when I'm in a really stuck place. Because I know I can have an honest conversation with God. I mean, think of the Psalms. There's a lot of really honest conversations with God there, and I feel like I've had a lot of those. I remember another moment, probably just a week into the whole diagnosis, and we were in the hospital. I think John and I were still both staying down there, and I remember looking at him and kind of just giving God an ultimatum, but I'm like looking at my husband doing it and saying, God, if this is what is, then you better well use it, and he has, and he does. And it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really that both and kind of living where joy and sorrow are mingled together.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing. And it's probably one of the most beautiful things. But I had to lean into God because it's really all I had.
Right. Right.
And it looks different. I guess I want to say too, it looks different. I mean, John would say if he was on here that his journey looked way different. And there was a lot of, anger of trying to figure out God's part in this and what does this do to my relationship with him. And I trust you, God, but I'm not happy right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the unique things about your story and what you do is that, you teach other people essentially how to grieve, right? I mean, you've led this class at Willow Creek on grief. You're teaching other people. Yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yet it's still hard. I mean, this afternoon, I'm going to sit with a mom who's just lost her son 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I'm still sitting here going, what am I going to say to her?
Yeah.
And all I can do is be with her and listen to her heart story and probably even some of the harder pieces of it.
Yeah.
So I think so much of the way that we learn to grieve is by sitting with and by listening to people's stories and being willing to enter into them and being willing to do the work, of our own stories. And I think, all of our griefs are like they're intertwined, right? And I'm sure you know this, Davey, like, somebody else in, I don't know, let's say in your neighborhood passes away. I'm sure it touches into somehow the loss of your wife. And for me, the loss of my son. I remember when I heard this young man that passed away, like all of a sudden I'm back to what happened for me and how I felt in that moment and in that time. And as I was planning a funeral and all those things. And so it has felt important to be available to walk alongside others. I talked earlier a little bit about community and, one of the beautiful parts about community, particularly in our case, in a diagnosis and they were walking alongside us. People showed up with their how God had wired them. There were meals, there were awesome meals, there were gift cards, there were people showing up to drive my kids. I said that, but there were also people that just said, knock on my door, and she'd say, I'm your neighbor. I love to garden. I'm a total mess. I don't even want to talk to you about this because I don't know what to say, but I want to weed in your garden. I know that's not a priority for you, but that's how God made me. And so that's what she did. Wow. And that was beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I think about this woman who's going to come today. I could bring her a meal, but I've also lost a son, and I can sit with her in this unique way because of what happened. And I'm willing to, John is willing to sit with others and be God's hands and feet because we have experienced something similar. Wow. So it feels like a part of, I guess, a part of my calling, a part of how God has wired me. I wouldn't have signed up for this part of the story ever, nor Certainly would you. Not. And but that's, I mean, a lot of what this podcast is really about, right? Sharing the stories and being with others in their hard places.
That's right. Well, and I wonder, as you kind of look at how you're walking with other people in grief, but also look at your own story and the immediate aftermath, and all the way up through these last 12 years, what are some of those critical, we call them waypoints, I guess, but the critical pillars that, nearly everybody's going to have to approach when it comes to grief? What are the things that you found like, man, this seems like a really critical part of grief that everybody seems to wrestle through? Their timing may be different, the pace may be different, but this is one of those things that, is going to be kind of a common denominator.
Yeah, I think, different things come to mind as we talk about that. I think, there's that initial kind of just shock factor. Now, my journey is different than like yours, where I kind of had, there was that possibility all along those 10 months that this could be a reality. So I was maybe a little further into the grief journey because of that. But initially right after, I always say it's kind of like anesthesia that God puts on. He knows you can only handle so much. And so I think that's why you're tired and you can't fully function. But I don't think God allows you to feel to be honest, the fullest pain of it. It's very raw in the beginning. But I think over time, particularly after, you get through that first year, I think some of that anesthesia starts to come off and you're able to look at the grief that is there.
Yeah.
I think, so that's a piece that does happen that I think is very natural. I think a practice that has helped too is, I always think about making time for your grief. Pre-grieving, sometimes we talk about where, you have a holiday or an anniversary coming up related to the loss, of making some space to pull away and put everything else down and just kind of sit with it and remember the person or the situation and sit with God in it. I think that has been super important. So when that day comes of their birthday or the anniversary of their death or whatever the loss is, you are not just rolled over like a tidal wave. I think that has been a pillar. I think having the community of people to talk about it has allowed me not to get stuck in my grief. We did the very class that you talked about that I've taught at a little bit at the church we attended, and finding a community to journey through your grief in it. And I think the other one is that very word through. Is I can avoid it. It's very easy to avoid it, to walk around it, but it's not going to go away. And, it's kind of like I always say, grief is a little bit like a crying baby, like an incessantly crying baby, and it needs attending to.
Wow.
You can put it down for a while, and I think you should. I think every once in a while you have to put it down and go do something joyful, or go take a walk, or go to a movie, or laugh. It's okay to laugh. Because you will just get lost and stuck. So those are those are some of the things that have been pivotal, important, and I think just being brutally honest with God.
Yeah.
About where you're at and how hard it is, and coming back to his word and thinking about, what it says. There's some of my favorite verses are Lamentations 3. And the version I love, I just pulled it up here, and it says, it's 19-25. It says, the thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I'll never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him. And as I look at that, like that first part, like it's like God is acknowledging, like it's hard. There's suffering and homelessness beyond words, and it is awful. I agree with you. And I want you to grieve, and I don't want you to forget. Remembering is an important part of our grieving. But then there's that line, that pivotal line in there. It says, yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. Can I get to the point in my grief where I can still dare to hope? And in the beginning, maybe I do need to borrow that hope from somebody else or from some other time in my story until I can get to the point where I can dare to hope again and be reminded that God is faithful and good. And he does show up each morning with these hand-picked mercies for me that I'm going to need today.
Wow. Joan, we had a listener ask a question the other day that it kind of just feel prompted to, in some ways, ask this, but I'll kind of give context. When you lost Will at 17 years old, and so there's so many different nuances when it comes to grief and loss. Nobody's story is the same, and everything, in different stages, it carries different things. And, so if you lose a young child, it carries certain emotions and feelings and,
right.
Implications. You lose a child who's an adult child, on maybe into their 30s and 40s, that carries some other implications. And there's something unique about losing a child who is right kind of on the precipice of, you said it earlier, like he was coming into his own. You were seeing this man really emerge.
Right.
And there's a uniqueness to that because, as a parent, there's this thought, this idea of investment into your kids, and then seeing that investment take that kind of that return on investment, becoming a parent and the fruit of it, and you feeling this joy. And my wife and I are in this, like we're in the investment stage. We're in 9, 8, and 2.5, but I'm sitting here thinking about this, and I think about it in terms of how I, the early conversations with my late wife's father, and one of the things that he said early on was, and everything we invested into her, and just like this budding, burgeoning potential that was like just starting to show itself. And he even said, it feels like it's all for naught. It feels like it's been in some ways wasted. Like, what is that? And it was his own, like, really vulnerable wrestling with that. And I just wonder what your insight is on that. Cause again, we had a listener who asked the question, something to the effect of, when you lose someone that there will always be that empty seat at the table. How is that redeemed? How is that not wasted? It feels like it's so wasted because you're always there. Nothing can replace that empty seat,
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what kind of got me tearful earlier as I was thinking about even things that are joyful. Our daughter just got married. My husband, we're going to have a 60th birthday party for him in a little while, and Will won't be there. Those are joyful things. And that seat's going to be empty. I always say the math is never going to add up again. I still stumble when somebody says, how many kids do you have?
Yeah.
I always have 4. Now I have 5 because of my son-in-law. But how can I kind of look at it this way. I have 3 kids here and I have 1 in heaven. I can still be a mom to Will. Days like this and moments like this of sharing his story is a way that I can steward his life forward.
Yeah.
I am so proud of that young man, and his story lives on. It's not over yet. And I have the responsibility to continue to steward that this side of heaven.
Wow.
And there will be a day, there's a great version in a children's Bible of the passage in Revelation, when all things sad will come untrue. There will be a day, a faithful day. In fact, that makes me think of Will when he was ill. The last maybe 3 months before, he was invited on, some awesome organizations was taking these cancer kids on a ski trip in Aspen, Colorado, of all places. And they would have a personal assistant with them all day long, skiing and taking care of them and doing all the things. And somehow we allowed him to go. He had been with me, the poor 16-year-old, every day for 9 months. And he went. And before he left us some letters, 4 letters that he had various people deliver to John and I that week, because he knew that we would miss him. And he signed each of those letters. One, he signed "Your favorite child." That was always kind of a big joke around our house, like who's the favorite child. But then there's one he signed, until that faith. He said faithful day. He meant faithful, I'm sure. But I think he meant faithful too, because it will be a faithful day when we get to join them in heaven again.
Yeah.
And all things sad will come untrue. But until then, I am called to parent my 3 kids here, but I'm also called in a different way. How can I find ways to parent this child that is living in heaven and not living here? And part of that is sitting with another parent who's lost a child, or teaching in that class at church, finding ways to steward their stories.
Wow.
I mean, that's a piece of what you're doing too, right?
Yeah. 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 There's something really powerful for me when our story becomes broadened into intersecting into other people's stories, just as you said earlier, where it becomes this shared thing, this collective advancing of the kingdom, stewarding these stories to the end of redemption, right?
Yeah, it is a beautiful thing to happen. And I think of that class we just talked about, it's like a grief support class, essentially. Yeah. And, there might be 100 people in that room, and you walk in those double doors and you can feel it. Yeah. You can feel the loss in that space. And it is hard, and it is a privilege to be with those people. And the last time I taught there, I remember saying, I remember the exact table I was at and the chair we often sat at. I said, I don't remember anything anybody taught. But I remember the faces around that table, and the losses and the stories that were shared, and the eyes of the people.
Wow.
God does his work in community around a table like that, where you're with somebody else who gets your loss.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's beautiful and messy and a privilege. And yes, it's a way to continue the work of the story that was their lives.
Phew. And Joan, the a big part of what you do now is this idea of helping people understand their story. You know, that I know that was something that was very impactful for you as well as you were navigating and journeying this grief. And it's huge for us too. It's paramount. You know, this idea of how do we say, we want to help you partner with God to take back your story, right? And really what we're saying is we want to help you understand how the redemption story that God is writing so that you can be an active agent in that, right? Come align yourself in that. But, you know, I'm curious as to how the concept of story for you, understanding, untangling, figuring out your story, writing your story, rewriting your story, those kinds of concepts, how critical was that in this grief journey for you? And what are some things you learned about, you know, about this? Because I'll say this, I noted 2 instances that you said some things that I think only someone who is very intuitive into their own story would have cited. One was that the day you found this out was your 20th wedding anniversary. And that's huge because I think when you begin to get really curious about your story and how God's showing up in it, you see, I've seen those things in my own story. I've heard countless times where people have said these 2 dates, these 2 diametrically opposed dates, right? They're happening at the same time. What does that mean? And then the other thing you said is you said that God put this family in your path very subtly, this pastor whose daughter, right? So I noticed that because that means you're very intuitive, like you're looking into your story, and that seems to be a very critical part of your grief journey. Can you talk a little bit about that, this story dynamic?
Yeah, story. I think it's a part of how God made me to be a listener, to be honest. And I discovered that many years ago, well before this piece of our story that we're talking about today. And I believe that story is, it's for me, it's a spiritual practice. It's not a been there, done that. I looked at my story one time with a counselor. I think there are clues of who God is in our stories. And there are clues of who he has made us to be for this time. And so will we be willing to be on a discovery mission with him to what those clues are?
Wow.
And I think he's revealing them all the time. And we're seeing like maybe 1%. But part of our spiritual formation, part of our spiritual growth is learning to have our eyes open to grow our awareness of God and of ourselves and of the community of God that he has put around us. And then all of a sudden, his story becomes brighter and broader, as you said, and you're able to see some of those connections. And it becomes, I think it's Karen Maines who says, it becomes like a God hunt. And that's a little piece of, when I said earlier, like documenting what was going on that Caring Bridge, that's a little piece of what was happening there.
Yeah.
Is every time we went to the hospital, we were on a God hunt. I mean, a cool story with that is the same pastor that had lost his daughter, or didn't lose his daughter, whose daughter had cancer. Will and I were talking to them one day and we're like, okay, what did you do to not, lose your mind down here at the hospital or on the way here? And Amanda said, well, one thing that we do is there's a homeless people population in the area. So sometimes we'll just bring sack lunches, pass them out. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. And Will was actually reading a book all about the homeless just prior to getting sick. And so Will started going down to the McDonald's at the hospital and buying gift cards, because that's part of what the book is. It said, buy them $5, $10, McDonald's gift cards. And so we started doing that, and it became this traffic light game as we got off the expressway to go to the hospital, because there was this set of homeless guys that were always at the bottom of the ramp. And in particular, there was this one man named Roger. And I would call Roger a friend now. I haven't seen him for several years now, but we would we'd time it so that we'd have 2 minutes with Roger at the bottom of the ramp. And for me, looking out at him, I'll have to send you a picture. He has the bluest eye. He has the eyes of Jesus.
Wow.
And here's this man who has nothing, looking into our story, asking how Will was. I can tell you a much longer story sometime about how he found out about Will's passing.
Wow.
But this man is one of the most pivotal pieces and people in my story of how we were reaching out to him, but he reached back to us and changed our life. So that little piece of our story, of Roger's story, of Will's story, God somehow gave us eyes to see that even in the midst of our grief. But that happens today. I was just telling somebody yesterday, we had a pastor friend stay here from England, and he was a bird watcher. And we have a bird feeder. I'm actually in the room that he stayed in, and he would get up super early and he'd get all excited when we came to breakfast. He's like, well, do you know you have this and this and this and this and this and this? And I'm like, no, we have blue jays and crows and
you have birds.
But I just didn't have eyes to see them.
Wow.
And nor was I looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's how our day is. God is at work in our days. Will we decide to see him or not?
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I know that. I'm sure you run into this in conversations. I've run into conversations where I kind of feel like that man talking to somebody. They're telling me their story, and I'm like, "Did you know you have this, and this in your story?" And they're like, "Huh, hadn't thought about that."
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, and that's what I do with people in spiritual direction. That's what I do with people that are on these solitude retreats. They're having a little bit of time to pull away and notice some of those things about God. Or as I sit with people doing story work, I mean, part of, if you look at my bio, I say, I love to help people connect the dots, and take this big, yarn ball of life and start to pull on one of the threads and see where God's at in it.
That's so beautiful. I love the picture of that. I mean, you've given us several metaphors just now, but even this, like the breadcrumbs or the clues, right? These God clues. It's like we're an investigator trying to figure out these puzzle pieces. And once we can get these puzzle pieces put together, we can begin to see a picture of things, right? And it reminds me of, Jeremiah 29:11, very, cliche verse that you hear often. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. But it says immediately after that, then you will seek me and you will find me if you seek me with your whole heart. And I think that's the critical piece right there. It's that God's there to be found, but he's not going to come in flashing lights most of the time. There are times he does, right? There are times that, but most of the time he's going, I want you to seek me. I want you to lean in. I want you to have eyes to see this. This is why Jesus said, those of you who have ears to hear, listen, right? And in some ways you could see him kind of speaking in code because he's wanting you to lean in and search and dig. And because when you do that, then you're going to uncover some things and you're going to find some things in your own story. And
what happens there, right? When I do seek and I move towards him and he moves towards me, right? That's where attunement happens. When I abide with him, my relationship with him grows. Yeah. And my relationship can even grow in, we talked about wrestling, right? Wrestling with God on the loss or how the math doesn't add up or just the anger piece of it. God uses the wrestling too to even woo us back for us to pursue him. So I know I get frustrated in the wrestling, but I have to remember God is at work even in that.
That's right.
And he says, you know what? I'm going to put this wrestling in there because I want my daughter back. I want my son back.
Yeah.
And this might be the way that I'm going to do that.
Wow. I would even go one step further, Joan, and say that is one of his primary methods. right? I mean, we see it in the story of Jacob. Jacob's name becomes Israel through the wrestling. Israel becomes the namesake for God's people. That's a very defining moment right there, where it's almost like God shining his light on that moment, going, this is what our relationship's going to be about right here. This is where you're going to find me, is in this wrestling. This is how we're going to interact right here. We're going to grapple together.
Yeah. In the wrestling and in the waiting, and his invitations are everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think we're expecting them to show up like the Amazon box at my door or the pretty Christmas package under the tree. And they might be under the rock or in the neighbor that's kind of cranky down the street, or the checkout clerk who's just having a bad day. And so will I be present enough to go, oh, I wonder where, can I be curious enough, I guess, to go, I wonder if God's in the middle of that right there, or this right here in my heart that I'm struggling with. Might that actually be an invitation? Can I reframe it? Can I resort some things in my story together with God? Can I, like you said, borrow hope from the past? And those might be ways of me finding God in the midst of what can be a really awful, painful season.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You know, I'm really curious. You brought up this two things that I want to talk about. One is this idea of spiritual direction. That's unique. It's different than counseling or coaching. It has its own unique place. And it's something that's, you know, one of the things that you do. You spend so much of your time helping people as a spiritual director. Can you kind of unpack that concept for us a little bit?
Yeah, it is different than coaching or counseling, right? So coaching or counseling, I'm probably, you know, presenting with a situation in my life, or I'm trying to get somewhere, and a coach or a counselor are awesome because they can help me navigate what might be, you know, a next step or a next question to, you know, get me to point B, or to resolve this thing over here.
Right.
Spiritual direction is very different than that. I don't really like the name of it. I think it needs a new name, because I'm not the director. God is the director, but I am the holder of the space for a conversation that person wants to have with God. And I can help them, remind them who they are. I can help them based off of what they are sharing, draw them closer to him, or point out some of these things that we just talked about. Like, gosh, have you ever noticed or ever wondered why this and this? Or, I mean, even some of the things you've done on the call today of, I heard you say this, let's sit with that for a little bit. Or what's a practice that goes with that? So it's for me, it's a little bit like, you know, when you're driving through the mountains in Colorado and there's a beautiful lookout. It's a little bit like creating a lookout in your life, and you've invited somebody to sit with you out there. Little pull off, right? Yeah. And there's all this beautiful landscape around, and you're looking out. And you're looking out at the present. You might also, at a lookout, you might think about where you've been. And then you might also ponder about what is coming next. So it's kind of like putting a comma in your life, in your spiritual life, and kind of just pausing for a bit and having a conversation with a companion, a guide on your journey. And so that metaphor sometimes is helpful for me in describing, you know, what it is. Yeah. It is not, I should do direction versus I should do counseling. You might do both at the same time. Right. Direction's a great place, as well as counseling, to do story work as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's amazing because I'm not sure you can really fully see your story without the help of other eyes looking in on it. You know?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. It's like, yeah, we have blind spots, right? I can't see my face. I mean, I can see it now because we're on Zoom, but I can't see my face without a mirror.
Yeah.
And I think part of what God calls us to as community is to be mirrors for other people.
Mm.
I think we live in a world that is desperately in need of other people to say, hey, I see this in you and it's beautiful.
Wow.
Do you know that you do this or you are this? We need more people to be mirrors for us.
Yeah.
To remind us who we are, to help us remember who we are and who God is.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So when did you start getting into this? Was this something that was kind of you would say a direct result of, losing Will, or is this work that you were doing beforehand that God's kind of, woven your story in with this, or how does
the
that
spiritual directions stuff?
Yeah, spiritual direction, story work, all of that kind of stuff.
Story work was already happening.
Okay.
And I think, just kind of prior to that, I had done a deep dive into using the maps that I talked about earlier, of just diving very deeply into my story. And I am a firm believer in that you can really only listen to the level that you've processed your own story. And so I had
unpack that a little bit. That's really interesting. I don't want to just gloss over what you just said right there. You can really only listen to the level that you have processed your own story.
And that might be Dan Allender or somebody, but I've sat with that quite a bit of, I can go and just kind of live through my life at a 2-inch level and, it'll probably be fine. And then, but let's say my family members, something really hard happens to them. I'm only going to be able to listen at that 2-inch deep level because I don't know how to dive any further because I've never done that in my own life. So why would I be able to do it with you?
Wow.
So that's part of the reason I think story work is so important, and story work together with God is so important because it teaches me how to live more fully in the present moment, right? And how to live the full life that he desires for us to live, like in John 10:10.
Yeah.
But it also allows me to go back and look at places in my story. I can travel back. I'm not going to live back there. I'm going to travel back together with God and look at pieces and threads and storylines and themes in my story that might provide hope for the future, that might help me unpack something that happened there that I'm living out of, a false narrative now that I might want to lay down.
Wow.
And it allows me to have a peek at the future together with God, not live in the future. That's called anxiety. But allow me to dream and to live out of the desires and longings that he's put in me. So my goal is to live in the present moment. But yes, I can look forward. I can look back together with God.
Wow. I love that you have to do the digging work in your own story before you can really, in a lot of ways, help other people to get to the depth of those places. I feel like today we're just in such an echo chamber so many times, right? With social media that there's so many voices. There's, everybody can retweet or repeat or re-Instagram, repost, whatever other people's stuff. But they're like, the true depth are the people that sit back, they reflect, they hold that space and they go, okay, God, where are you? What's your voice into all of this? Right.
Yeah. And whose voice do you want playing in your head and influencing your actions or your motives or your conversations? It's going to be the voice that you spend the most time with.
Yeah. Yeah. Which kind of leads us to some of the things that you guys do with the retreats, the silence and solitude retreats. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because literally just the other day, my wife, Christy, said, hey, I think next time we do our little quarterly getaway, we should spend like the first 8 hours just doing silence and solitude. And I love that idea because I'm well, I don't know if you speak Enneagram. I'm an Enneagram
I do.
three wing 4. So
Okay.
the 4 side of me is like, yeah, I'll sit back and reflect and write, do all, whatever, just
Yeah.
listen to the Lord. She's Enneagram 7. So it freaked her out even just saying it.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm
Cause
really proud of her for saying that out
exactly. I was like,
loud.
wow, look at you. Okay. Let's do that,
Look at
And
that,
so,
being all
but
vulnerable.
it's not something that we have done, and it's not a
Mm-hmm.
practice that we do. And I'm really intrigued in this personally. Okay. And then maybe everybody else can benefit from this as well. What does that look like? What do you guys do? Why is that important? Talk to me about these silence and solitude retreats.
I know it's not something you're like, oh, I can't wait to sign up for that. Gail and I, at the time before we started Sacred, and the website's called mylifeissacred.com.
Okay.
And so, we were teaching a class. It was a 2-hour class, weekly class, spiritual formation focused. And we always began with scripture and some quiet, and then a little bit of teaching, and then gave them essentially just some reflection questions, some solitude time on their own, literally like 20 minutes. And then they came back together in community. And one day we just started dreaming, like, what if they had more than that? Because that was the one thing that people were like, I need that in my life, the solitude part.
Yeah,
but
like
I don't know how to
drinking a big old gulp of water when you're so parched. Right? It's like,
when you're so parched, and you don't know it until you slow down enough sometimes. And so we're like, okay, well, what if they had the whole day? And do we think people would come? Would men and women come? Would ministry leaders come? Would couples come? And we just started dreaming, and we found some places that were possibilities of where to do it. And we thought about what the day might look like. And we had a friend who helped with the website, and another one with a logo. And all of a sudden it just started unfolding in front of us. And to be honest, the rhythm of the day had stayed the same for the last, we started in 2013, 9 years, essentially, where we start in community with just some of the things I talked about. We talk about what it's like to slow down, and that we set our expectations for the day. Really, there's only 2 expectations: that God is here and that you are loved. And we encourage people to let everything else go. All the things you thought you'd get solved, and books you thought you'd get read, and conversations you thought you'd have with God. Can you lay them all down and just go, if I can walk away today knowing that God loves me and he's going to show me in some unique way today, and that he's present, that is enough. And that there's really only one rule with our day of solitude, and that is simply that you don't have to produce anything.
What's and that
like? I know that trips people up. They're like, you can see them, they're like taking notes, like, okay, the one rule, I don't have to produce anything. And then so we, start together, and we name like how we're feeling going into it. Like, I'm really nervous, or I'm unsure how this is going. What if God doesn't speak to me? All those really valid questions and concerns, and we name them out loud. And then you kind of have the middle of the day to yourself. We always pick a really beautiful place, and we have some experiences for people to, have a few handholds if they are a little bit stuck. So there might be some art experience, or, music, or a visual kind of thing. So they've always got some things to come back to. And then at the end of the day, we call this kind of our time of harvest, where you individually, and then around your table and around the room, we talk about, how did God show up and how'd it go? Because it's important to kind of name what happened. I think so often in life, we don't stop to pause. We go on to the next good thing. We don't pause to reflect and name and notice, where was God today, and what was hard, and what would I do differently, and what was impactful. And then we talk a little bit about, okay, this experience happened, but what is God really calling us to do in life? And it's not just to go from one good retreat to the next good retreat to the next message at church. Yes, it was a good day, but he is calling, and he modeled for us a rhythm of pulling away to be with him in solitude, and then going out to his people. Henry Nouwen talks about this too, and describes this really well. to go out and be with his people in community in beautiful ways because you've been with the Father first. Right. It's called the cycle of grace. Yeah. And then from there, out of that community, you can go out and do ministry. So ministry then becomes an outflow, not the starting point of everything. Because so often we do this cycle backwards.
Yeah.
We begin with work and ministry and all the things. And what happens? We get tired. We get exhausted. And then we go back to our people and they don't give us what we need. Yep. They don't pat us on the back the way we want it to. And then we go running back to our Father, which is fine too. But God says, I have a way for you, my precious daughter, my precious son. And it begins with me. So that's what the day is about. That's what excites us about doing these retreats, not just to do another retreat and to have a day of quiet, but it's a day to be with God and start to understand the rhythm of life that he's really drawing us to. I mean, a lot of it's based on, I love, Matthew 11:28-30 in the Message, right? And it says, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it, learn my unforced rhythms of grace. And, he wants us to learn to live freely and lightly. Yeah. And so that's the invitation of a day of retreat like that.
I love that. Yeah, that unforced rhythms of grace in that Message version is just really powerful. And what I love about what you're saying, the Jewish day is evening and then morning, right? So it starts with evening, which is starting with rest. This is how God set it up.
That's how he set it up. Go back to Genesis, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He gave Adam a job, right? And on day 6. And the first day of Adam's job was what? Day 7. Rest.
Yeah, rest.
So it's this, you're right. We see this, it's so backwards. How many leaders, pastors, church leaders, how many people are just getting burnt out because they're starting with achieve, work, produce, right? Take the next hill. And then it's like, oh, and then I got to get away and I got to find that rest. And you're saying, no, we need to start from this place of being filled with the Father, filled with his Spirit. And that only happens with us retreating, silence and solitude. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. Here's what I love about this conversation, Joan. We could sit and have this conversation. We could talk for a couple more hours easily. And maybe we can convince you to come back and we'll talk some more about some things. We would love to keep talking about some of this stuff and more. But what I love about this is if you're watching this on YouTube, you've seen a drastic difference in even Joan's countenance. Like I'm seeing in this, and I see this, I've experienced it myself. When we talk about the grief of our story, you still hold that grief very raw and real, right? We've shed and shared tears on this conversation, right? This call.
Right.
But then as you started talking about some of the purpose that this pain has infused into your life, you've started to come alive. And you're like, there's this excitement and your countenance is glowing because of it. And I think what I want to note is that those two things are held together. Yeah. Because I feel like, and this, that so many people, as they're walking through grief and pain, they're in the depths of it. They're in the middle of that deep, dark night of the soul. They're wondering, is there ever going to be life in me again? Is there ever going to be hope in me again? And I just want this conversation to be evidence of the fact that, yes, there is. But it means you're going to have to do some of this work that we're talking about. And finding God in these stories, looking for him, seeking, and you'll find him. You'll find him.
Yeah, I just want to encourage people. It is worth it. It's hard, but the alternative is doing life alone, or the alternative is being stuck in my loss, my grief. And that's the last thing that I want for me. That's the last thing I want for them. And God is sitting there waiting and pursuing them.
Yeah. Wow. So good. Joan, where can we connect with you? We'll put all this stuff on the page, the show notes and the page that we have up, but we'd love to know website, social media. Where can we, follow and connect with you?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the 2 websites. One is the retreat ministry called Sacred, and the link there is mylifeissacred.com.
Okay.
And then for the story ministry, it is called onelifemaps.com, and the curriculum is called Listen to My Life, and you can purchase that there. The individual maps are all 8 of the maps in the portfolio, and that is at onelifemaps.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for spending time with us. This has been awesome.
Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.